The morning sun was just starting to peek through the oak trees lining Meadowbrook Drive when Detective James pulled into his driveway. He'd been working the night shift for 3 months now, part of a special task force targeting drug trafficking in the city. His black Jeep Cherokee looked ordinary enough, but it was equipped with special radio equipment and had been his partner through some pretty intense operations. James had moved to Meadowbrook Heights 2 years ago, drawn by the quiet streets and well-maintained homes. The neighborhood had that perfect suburban feel. Kids riding bikes, neighbors chatting over fences, and an active homeowners association that kept everything looking pristine. Sometimes maybe a little too pristine. But James appreciated having a peaceful place to come home to after dealing with the chaos of police work. As he parked in his designated spot, James noticed Mrs. Peterson from across the street peeking through her curtains. She always seemed to be watching something, though she'd never actually spoken to him beyond a polite wave. He grabbed his gym bag from the passenger seat and headed inside, looking forward to a few hours of sleep before his next shift. What James didn't know was that his Jeep had caught the attention of someone else in the neighborhood. Patricia Mills, the vice president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, had been making her morning walk when she spotted the vehicle. Patricia took her HOA duties very seriously, perhaps more seriously than anyone else in the neighborhood appreciated. Patricia had lived in Meadowbrook Heights for 15 years and had been involved with the HOA for most of that time. She knew every rule in the community handbook by heart and wasn't shy about enforcing them. Her neighbors had mixed feelings about her dedication. Some appreciated her attention to detail, while others found her approach a bit too aggressive. The thing about Patricia was that she genuinely believed she was protecting the community. In her mind, every violation of the HOA rules was a threat to property values and neighborhood standards. She'd seen other communities decline when people stopped caring about the details, and she was determined not to let that happen in Meadowbrook Heights. As she walked past James's house that morning, something about the Jeep bothered her. She couldn't quite put her finger on it at first. It wasn't the vehicle itself. It was clean and in good condition, but there was something about how it was parked. Or maybe it was the fact that she hadn't seen it before. Patricia prided herself on knowing every car that belonged in the neighborhood. She stopped walking and pulled out her phone to check the community app, where residents were supposed to register their vehicles. The HOA had implemented this system 6 months ago, after some issues with unauthorized parking. Patricia scrolled through the list twice, but she couldn't find any record of a black Jeep Cherokee registered to that address. This was exactly the kind of situation Patricia felt she was meant to handle. In her experience, people often thought they could get away with ignoring HOA rules, but that's where she came in. She dealt with everything from unauthorized satellite dishes to the wrong shade of mailbox paint. An unregistered vehicle seemed like a straightforward violation. Patricia decided to walk by the house again, this time paying closer attention to the Jeep. As she got closer, she noticed it had some kind of special equipment inside. She could see extra radio gear and what looked like official equipment. This made her even more suspicious.
Why would someone have all that stuff in their car unless they were up to something?
The more Patricia thought about it, the more convinced she became that this vehicle didn't belong in the neighborhood. Maybe it was stolen, or maybe someone was using Meadowbrook Heights as a place to dump unwanted cars. She'd heard stories about people abandoning vehicles in nice neighborhoods, hoping they'd go unnoticed for a while. Patricia walked back to her own house and sat down at her kitchen table with the HOA handbook. She flipped to the section about unauthorized vehicles and parking violations. According to the rules, vehicles had to be registered with the HOA within 48 hours of arrival in the community. Unregistered vehicles could be considered abandoned property after 72 hours. The problem was, Patricia didn't know exactly when the Jeep had appeared. She hadn't noticed it yesterday during her morning walk, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. She decided to call her friend Dorothy, who lived 2 houses down from James. Dorothy was retired and spent a lot of time in her front garden, so she might have seen when the vehicle arrived. Dorothy answered on the second ring. After exchanging pleasantries, Patricia got to the point. Have you noticed that black Jeep parked at the house across from Mrs. Peterson's? I don't think it's registered with the HOA. Dorothy thought for a moment. Oh, you mean at James's place? I think I saw it there yesterday evening, but I'm not really sure. Why do you ask? Well, if it's not registered, it could be considered abandoned property, Patricia explained. We can't just let people dump their vehicles in our neighborhood. It sets a bad precedent. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with Dorothy being somewhat non-committal about the whole situation. She suggested that Patricia might want to just knock on James's door and ask about the vehicle before taking any formal action. But Patricia had already made up her mind about the proper way to handle this situation. After hanging up with Dorothy, Patricia spent the next hour researching the HOA's options for dealing with unauthorized vehicles. The rules were pretty clear. If a vehicle was unregistered and appeared to be abandoned, the HOA had the authority to have it removed from the community. The process usually involved putting a notice on the vehicle first, giving the owner 24 hours to respond. But as Patricia thought about it more, she began to worry that whoever owned the Jeep might simply move it to avoid the towing fee, only to bring it back later. She'd seen that happen before with other violations. People would temporarily fix the problem just long enough to avoid consequences, then go back to breaking the rules. Patricia decided that a more direct approach was needed. If the vehicle was truly abandoned, then removing whatever was securing it and having it towed immediately would send a clear message to the entire community. The HOA needed to show that it was serious about enforcing the rules. She spent the rest of the morning preparing for what she saw as her civic duty. Patricia gathered the tools she thought she might need and reviewed the HOA's contact information for the towing company they used for violations. In her mind, she was protecting the community from the kind of decline that happened when people stopped caring about standards. What Patricia didn't realize was that her assumptions about the Jeep and its owner were completely wrong. She had no idea that James was not only a legitimate resident of Meadowbrook Heights, but also a law enforcement officer whose vehicle was equipped for official police business. Her well-intentioned but misguided attempt to enforce HOA rules was about to create a situation that no one in the neighborhood could have anticipated. The afternoon heat was starting to build when Patricia made her decision. She had spent most of the day thinking about the situation with the unregistered Jeep, and her resolve had only grown stronger. In her mind, this wasn't just about one vehicle. It was about maintaining the standards that made Meadowbrook Heights the kind of place where people wanted to live. Patricia had called the HOA president, Robert Chen, earlier that morning to discuss the situation. Robert was a busy man who ran his own consulting business from home, and he generally trusted Patricia to handle day-to-day enforcement issues. When she explained about the unregistered vehicle, he gave her the go-ahead to follow standard procedures. "Just make sure you document everything properly," Robert had told her. "We need to follow the rules exactly so we don't have any legal issues later." Patricia had assured him that she knew the procedures by heart. What she didn't mention was her growing impatience with what she saw as a deliberate attempt to flout community rules. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that immediate action was necessary. Around 2 in the afternoon, Patricia decided to take another look at the Jeep. She walked casually down the street, trying to appear like she was just out for her regular exercise. As she approached James's house, she could see that the vehicle was still there, parked in the same spot as that morning. This time, Patricia noticed something she hadn't seen before. There was a chain and lock securing something under the hood, probably an anti-theft device of some kind. This actually made her more suspicious rather than less. Why would someone need such elaborate security for a legitimate vehicle in a safe neighborhood like Meadowbrook Heights? Patricia pulled out her phone and took several photos of the Jeep from different angles. She made sure to capture the license plate, the special equipment visible through the windows, and the security chain. In her mind, she was building a case that would justify whatever action the HOA needed to take. As she was taking photos, Mrs. Peterson came out to check her mailbox. The elderly woman had lived in the neighborhood longer than almost anyone else and had seen it change over the years. She noticed Patricia with her phone and walked over to see what was happening. "Everything all right, dear?" Mrs. Peterson asked in her gentle voice. Patricia lowered her phone and explained the situation. "I'm documenting this unregistered vehicle. It's been here for at least a day, maybe longer, and the owner hasn't followed proper procedures for registering it with the HOA." Mrs. Peterson looked at the Jeep and then back at Patricia. "Are you sure it doesn't belong to James? He seems like such a nice young man. Always waves when he sees me in the garden." "That's exactly the problem," Patricia replied, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "People think they can just ignore the rules because they seem nice. But rules exist for everyone's benefit. If we start making exceptions, where does it end? Mrs. Peterson nodded politely, though she didn't seem entirely convinced. Maybe you could just leave a note asking him to register it. Sometimes people forget about these things when they're busy. Patricia had considered that approach, but she was concerned it would be too lenient. The handbook is very clear about the procedures for dealing with violations. We need to show that the HOA takes these matters seriously. After Mrs. Peterson went back inside, Patricia spent another few minutes studying the Jeep. The security chain was definitely going to be a problem if the HOA decided to have the vehicle towed. Most towing companies wouldn't touch a car that was locked up like that, especially without clear proof that they had the authority to remove it. Patricia went back to her house and spent the next hour researching her options. She found several online forums where HOA board members discussed similar situations. The general consensus seemed to be that security devices were often used by people trying to prevent legitimate towing of vehicles they had no right to park in certain areas. The more Patricia read, the more convinced she became that she was dealing with someone who was deliberately trying to circumvent HOA authority. The security chain wasn't just protecting the vehicle, it was a challenge to the community's right to enforce its own rules. By 4 o'clock, Patricia had made up her mind. She went to her garage and found the bolt cutters her late husband had used for various home improvement projects. They were heavy-duty cutters designed for thick wire and small chains. Patricia tested them on an old piece of cable and was satisfied that they would do the job. Patricia spent a few minutes practicing with the cutters, making sure she could operate them efficiently. She didn't want to be standing out in the open any longer than necessary. The last thing she needed was for neighbors to start asking questions before she could complete her mission. As she prepared for what she saw as her civic duty, Patricia reviewed the HOA handbook one more time. The rules about abandoned vehicles were clear. The association had the authority to remove unauthorized cars from community property. In her interpretation, this included vehicles that were secured in ways that prevented proper inspection or identification. Patricia also thought about the potential consequences of her actions. She knew that some people might question her methods, but she was confident that she was acting within her authority as an HOA board member. The community had elected her to enforce the rules, and that's exactly what she intended to do. At 5:30, Patricia decided it was time to act. She had noticed that James's house had been quiet all day with no signs of activity. The driveway was empty except for the Jeep, and there were no lights on inside the house. This seemed like the perfect time to handle the situation without confrontation. Patricia put the bolt cutters in a canvas bag and walked purposefully toward James's house. She had decided to approach this as a straightforward enforcement action. Cut the security chain, call the towing company, and let them handle the removal. By the time the vehicle's owner realized what had happened, it would already be impounded and they would have to go through proper channels to get it back. As she walked, Patricia noticed that several neighbors were outside working in their gardens or walking their dogs. She nodded politely to each of them, maintaining the appearance of someone going about normal HOA business. In her mind, that's exactly what she was doing. When Patricia reached the Jeep, she paused for a moment to double-check her decision. The vehicle definitely looked out of place to her, with its special equipment and security measures. She couldn't understand why anyone would need all that gear unless they were involved in something questionable. Patricia opened her canvas bag and pulled out the bolt cutters. The chain was thicker than she had expected, but the cutters were designed for heavy-duty work. She positioned them carefully around one of the links and began to apply pressure. The first attempt didn't quite work. The chain was made of hardened steel and the cutters slipped slightly. Patricia adjusted her grip and tried again, this time putting her full weight behind the effort. She could feel the metal beginning to give way under the pressure. What Patricia didn't realize was that Mrs. Peterson had been watching from her kitchen window. The elderly woman was becoming increasingly concerned about what she was seeing. It was one thing to leave a note or make a phone call, but actually cutting someone's security chain seemed like a much more serious matter. Mrs. Peterson considered going outside to ask Patricia what she was doing, but she decided instead to call her son who lived across town. Her son had served on an HOA board at his own community and might have some insight into whether Patricia's actions were appropriate. Meanwhile, Patricia was making progress with the bolt cutters. The chain was definitely weakening, and she estimated it would take just a few more attempts to cut completely through it. She paused to catch her breath and looked around to make sure no one was paying too much attention to what she was doing. From Patricia's perspective, everything was going according to plan. She was following what she believed to be proper procedures for dealing with an abandoned vehicle, and she would soon have the situation resolved. The HOA would demonstrate its commitment to community standards, and other residents would understand that the rules applied to everyone. What Patricia couldn't have imagined was that her actions were being recorded by James's security camera system, and that the vehicle she was preparing to have towed belonged to a police detective who was sleeping inside the house, recovering from a long night of dangerous undercover work. The metallic snap of the chain breaking echoed across the quiet afternoon air. Patricia stepped back and examined her work with satisfaction. The security chain now hung loose from the Jeep's hood, its severed ends gleaming in the sunlight. She carefully placed the bolt cutters back in her canvas bag and pulled out her phone to call the towing company. Patricia had used Meadowbrook towing services for previous HOA violations, and they knew the procedures for removing unauthorized vehicles from the community. She dialed their number and waited for someone to answer, feeling confident that she had handled the situation professionally and by the book. Meadowbrook Towing. This is Dave speaking. Hello, Dave. This is Patricia Mills from the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. We have another unauthorized vehicle that needs to be removed from the community. Dave knew Patricia well from previous calls. She was always very thorough with her paperwork and never called unless she was certain about a violation. Sure thing, Mrs. Mills. What's the location and vehicle description? Patricia provided all the details, including the license plate number and the fact that she had already removed the security chain that might have prevented towing. Dave told her that a truck would be there within the hour, and that he would need her to sign the authorization paperwork when they arrived. After hanging up, Patricia took a few more photos of the Jeep for her records. She wanted to document the condition of the vehicle and the fact that the security chain had been properly removed according to HOA procedures. In her mind, everything was proceeding exactly as it should. What Patricia didn't notice was that Mrs. Peterson had been watching the entire incident from her kitchen window. The elderly woman was deeply troubled by what she had witnessed. She had called her son during Patricia's phone call with the towing company, and he had strongly advised her to contact the homeowner immediately. Mrs. Peterson had James's phone number from the neighborhood directory, but she was hesitant to call someone she didn't know well. Instead, she decided to walk over and knock on his door. If he was home, he needed to know what was happening to his vehicle. If he wasn't home, at least she would have tried to give him a chance to handle the situation. Meanwhile, inside his house, James was deep in the kind of exhausted sleep that only comes after working a dangerous undercover operation. His phone was on silent mode, and he had blackout curtains drawn to block out the afternoon sun. He had no idea that his vehicle was about to be towed, or that his security system had recorded the entire incident. Mrs. Peterson made her way slowly across the street, using her walker to maintain her balance. At 83 years old, she didn't move as quickly as she once had, but she was determined to do the right thing. She had watched Patricia cut through that chain, and something about the whole situation just didn't feel right to her. When Mrs. Peterson reached James's front door, she pressed the doorbell and waited. After a minute with no response, she tried knocking gently. She could hear what sounded like a television or radio playing somewhere inside the house, but no one came to the door. Mrs. Peterson tried the doorbell one more time, pressing it longer and harder. She was beginning to worry that she wouldn't be able to reach James before the tow truck arrived. From her kitchen window, she had heard Patricia mention that the truck would be there within an hour. Inside the house, James finally began to stir. The persistent doorbell had penetrated through his exhausted sleep, and he was slowly becoming aware that someone was at his door. He checked his phone and saw that it was almost 6 o'clock. He had been asleep for about 8 hours, which was decent rest after his overnight shift. James threw on a t-shirt and made his way to the front door, still groggy from sleep. When he looked through the peephole, he saw Mrs. Peterson standing on his porch with her walker. This was unusual. They had never spoken beyond friendly waves, and he couldn't imagine what might bring her to his door. When James opened the door, Mrs. Peterson looked relieved to see him. "Oh good, you are home. I'm so sorry to bother you, but I think you need to know what's happening with your Jeep." James was immediately alert. "What's wrong with my Jeep?" Mrs. Peterson quickly explained what she had witnessed. Patricia cutting through the security chain and calling a tow truck to have the vehicle removed. She spoke rapidly, worried that the tow truck might arrive at any moment. James felt a surge of adrenaline as he processed what Mrs. Peterson was telling him. His Jeep wasn't just his personal vehicle. It was equipped with thousands of dollars worth of police communications equipment and was currently assigned to his task force operations. The security chain that had been cut was department-issued equipment designed to prevent theft of sensitive police gear. "Are you sure about this?" James asked, though he could see from Mrs. Peterson's expression that she was completely certain. "I watched the whole thing from my kitchen window," she replied. "That lady from the HOA cut your chain with some kind of big scissors, and then she called for a tow truck. She said it would be here within an hour, and that was about 20 minutes ago." James thanked Mrs. Peterson and quickly stepped outside to check on his vehicle. Sure enough, the security chain was cut and hanging loose from the hood. He could see Patricia across the street, standing in her driveway with what appeared to be paperwork in her hands, clearly waiting for the tow truck to arrive. The situation was both infuriating and potentially disastrous. James's Jeep contained encrypted radio equipment, surveillance gear, and case files related to ongoing investigations. Having it towed to a public lot would be a security nightmare. Not to mention the embarrassment of having to explain to his supervisors how his police vehicle ended up impounded by an HOA. James walked quickly toward Patricia, who seemed surprised to see him approaching. She'd been expecting the homeowner to be absent, which would have made the towing process much simpler and less confrontational. "Excuse me," James called out as he got closer. "I understand there's some confusion about my vehicle." Patricia straightened up and adopted what she considered to be her official HOA voice. "Sir, are you the owner of the black Jeep Cherokee parked at this address?" "Yes, I am, and I live here. My name is James Washington, and I've been a resident of this community for 2 years. Patricia consulted her paperwork. "Mr. Washington, our records show that vehicle is not registered with the Homeowners Association. According to community guidelines, all vehicles must be registered within 48 hours of arrival." James took a deep breath, trying to remain calm despite his growing frustration. "I wasn't aware that I needed to register my personal vehicle with the HOA. No one mentioned that when I moved in, and I never received any paperwork about vehicle registration. The requirements are clearly outlined in the community handbook that every resident receives," Patricia replied. "Failure to register vehicles can result in them being classified as abandoned property." "And that gives you the right to cut my security chain?" James asked, pointing toward his Jeep. Patricia's confidence wavered slightly, but she held her ground. "Unauthorized security devices on abandoned vehicles are considered impediments to proper enforcement procedures. The HOA has the authority to remove such devices when necessary." James realized that this situation was escalating beyond a simple misunderstanding. Patricia seemed genuinely convinced that she was acting within her authority, but she had no idea that she had just committed a crime by destroying police equipment and interfering with law enforcement operations. Just then, a large tow truck rounded the corner and began making its way down Meadowbrook Drive. Patricia looked relieved to see it approaching, while James felt his stress level spike even higher. He needed to resolve this situation immediately, before his police vehicle ended up in an impound lot where anyone might have access to sensitive law enforcement equipment. The next few minutes would determine whether this remained a neighborhood dispute or became something much more serious. James knew he had to handle this carefully, both as a resident trying to protect his property and as a police officer dealing with someone who had unknowingly interfered with official police business, and the tow truck pulled up in front of his house. James made a decision that would change everything about how this situation played out. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his police badge and identification. The moment James held up his police badge, the entire atmosphere of the situation changed. Patricia's confident expression faltered as she stared at the official identification in James's hand. The tow truck driver, who had just climbed out of his cab with a clipboard, stopped walking and looked uncertainly between James and Patricia. "Ma'am, I'm Detective James Washington with the Metro Police Department," James said, his voice taking on an official tone. "That vehicle you just had prepared for towing is department equipment assigned to a special task force operation." Patricia felt her stomach drop as the full implications of what James was saying began to sink in. She looked at the badge, then at James's face, then back at the Jeep with its cut security chain. I had no idea, she stammered. The vehicle wasn't registered with the HOA. Dave, the tow truck driver, had dealt with enough complicated situations to know when to step back and let people sort things out. Folks, I'm going to need some clarification here before I can do anything with that vehicle. If it's police equipment, I can't just hook it up and haul it away. James nodded to Dave. That's correct. This vehicle is assigned to active police operations, and that security chain you see cut on the ground was department-issued anti-theft equipment. He turned back to Patricia. What you've done here could be considered interference with police operations and destruction of government property. The words hit Patricia like a physical blow. In all her years of HOA enforcement, she had never imagined that her actions could be considered criminal. She had genuinely believed she was protecting the community and following proper procedures. But the rules clearly state that unauthorized vehicles can be removed, she said weakly. Unauthorized by whom? James asked. I'm a homeowner in this community. I pay my HOA fees and follow the community guidelines. I was never told that I needed to register my personal vehicle with anyone. Mrs. Peterson, who had been watching the confrontation from her front porch, slowly made her way over to join the group. She felt partially responsible for the situation since she had tried to warn James, but perhaps not soon enough. Detective Washington, she said quietly, I saw the whole thing happen. I tried to call your attention to it as soon as I could. James smiled gratefully at the elderly woman. Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. I appreciate you looking out for me. Patricia was beginning to realize just how badly she had mishandled the situation. Detective Washington, I want to apologize. I had no way of knowing you were a police officer or that this was an official vehicle. From my perspective, it appeared to be an unregistered car that had been abandoned in the community. But you didn't attempt to contact me before taking action, James pointed out. You didn't leave a note, make a phone call, or try to verify ownership. You went straight to cutting my security equipment and calling for towing. Dave, the tow truck driver, was starting to understand that he had walked into a much more complicated situation than a routine HOA towing. Mrs. Mills, I think I need to head back to the shop. This isn't the kind of situation my company wants to get involved in. Patricia nodded numbly as Dave climbed back into his truck and drove away. She was beginning to comprehend that her aggressive enforcement approach had led to serious consequences. What happens now? She asked James. James looked at his damaged security chain and thought about the potential security breach that could have occurred if his vehicle had actually been towed. The Jeep contained sensitive case files, encrypted communications equipment, and surveillance gear that could compromise ongoing investigations if it fell into the wrong hands. That depends on several factors, James replied. First, I need to assess what damage has been done and whether any security protocols have been compromised. Second, I need to understand how the HOA's procedures led to this situation so it doesn't happen again. By now, several other neighbors had noticed the commotion and were gathering at a respectful distance. Word was beginning to spread through the community that something significant was happening. Robert Chen, the HOA president, received a phone call from one of the residents and was rushing over to see what was going on. Patricia realized that her actions were about to become very public within the community. Detective Washington, is there any way we can resolve this quietly? I never intended for any of this to happen. James understood Patricia's concern, but he also knew that there were larger issues at play. Mrs. Mills, I appreciate that you thought you were doing the right thing, but what happened here today could have had serious consequences for public safety. If my vehicle had been towed with sensitive police equipment inside, it could have compromised active investigations. Robert Chen arrived just as James was explaining the severity of the situation. The HOA president was out of breath from rushing over, and his face was flushed with both exertion and embarrassment. Detective Washington, I'm so sorry about this misunderstanding. Patricia called me this morning about an unregistered vehicle, but I had no idea it belonged to a police officer. Mr. Chen, I think we need to have a serious discussion about your community's vehicle registration requirements, James said. I've lived here for 2 years and never received any information about registering my personal vehicle with the HOA. Robert looked confused. But we sent out the vehicle registration forms to all residents 6 months ago. Everyone was supposed to submit information about their cars so we could keep track of authorized vehicles. Mrs. Peterson spoke up from her position nearby. Robert, I never received any forms either, and I've been living here for 12 years. This revelation added another layer of complexity to the situation. It appeared that the HOA's communication system had failed, and residents hadn't received the information they needed to comply with the new vehicle registration requirements. James could see that the situation was more complicated than simple HOA overreach. There had been communication failures, procedural mistakes, and assumptions made by multiple people. However, that didn't change the fact that his police equipment had been damaged and his vehicle had nearly been compromised. Here's what needs to happen, James said, taking charge of the situation. First, I need to file a report about the damage to department property. Second, the HOA needs to review its communication procedures to make sure residents actually receive important information. Third, we need to establish clear protocols for handling suspected violations before taking action. Patricia nodded eagerly, relieved that James seemed willing to work toward a solution rather than simply pressing charges. I'll pay for any damages to your security equipment, she offered, and I'll make sure the HOA board reviews our enforcement procedures. Robert Chen was already thinking about the potential liability issues for the association. Detective Washington, what kind of legal exposure are we looking at here? I want to make sure we handle this properly. James appreciated Robert's direct approach. That depends on how we move forward from here. If the HOA is willing to take corrective action and ensure this doesn't happen again, I'm inclined to treat this as a civil matter rather than a criminal one. The relief on Patricia's face was visible, but James wasn't finished. However, I do need to make sure that all neighbors understand the seriousness of what happened today. This wasn't just a simple towing mistake. It was interference with police operations that could have compromised public safety. As more neighbors gathered to watch the discussion, James realized that this incident could actually become a teaching moment for the entire community. The way they handled the aftermath would determine whether Meadowbrook Heights became a more cooperative place to live, or whether it would be divided by the controversy. 3 weeks after the incident, Meadowbrook Heights looked the same as always, but the community dynamics had changed in ways both subtle and significant. James was finishing up his morning coffee when he heard a knock at his door. He opened it to find Patricia Mills standing on his porch, holding a manila envelope and looking considerably more humble than the last time they had spoken. Detective Washington, I hope I'm not disturbing you, Patricia said. I wanted to personally deliver the check for the replacement security equipment and give you an update on the changes we've made to the HOA procedures. James invited her in, and they sat in his living room. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of meetings, policy reviews, and community discussions. True to his word, James had treated the matter as a civil issue rather than pursuing criminal charges, but he had insisted on comprehensive changes to prevent similar incidents. Patricia opened the envelope and handed James a check for $850, covering the cost of the specialized security chain and lock that had been damaged. The HOA board approved this payment unanimously, she said. We also voted to create a special fund for situations where our enforcement actions cause unintended damage. I appreciate that, James replied, examining the check. But more importantly, what steps have been taken to prevent this from happening again? Patricia pulled out a folder containing several documents. We've completely overhauled our communication system. Every resident now receives important notifications through multiple channels: email, regular mail, text message if they've provided a phone number, and postings on the community bulletin boards, she continued. We've also implemented a new 3-step process for enforcement actions. First, we attempt direct contact with the homeowner. Second, we post a notice and wait 72 hours for a response. Only after those steps can we take any action involving someone's property. James nodded approvingly. These were exactly the kinds of procedural safeguards he had recommended during the emergency HOA board meeting that had been called after the incident. What about the vehicle registration requirement itself? We've made it optional rather than mandatory, Patricia explained. Residents can register their vehicles if they want faster resolution of any future issues, but it's no longer required. We also clarified that the HOA's authority extends only to common areas, not to vehicles parked on individual property. The changes went beyond just policy modifications. The incident had sparked broader conversations throughout Meadowbrook Heights about community governance, communication, and the balance between maintaining standards and respecting residents' rights. Robert Chen had taken the lead on many of these discussions, organizing several community meetings where residents could voice their concerns and suggestions. The overwhelming feedback was that people wanted an HOA that maintained property values and community standards. But they also wanted fairness and transparency in how rules were enforced. Mrs. Peterson had become something of a neighborhood hero for her role in alerting James to what was happening. Several residents had approached her to thank her for her quick thinking and civic courage. She had also been asked to join a new community oversight committee that would review HOA enforcement actions. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," Patricia said, looking somewhat nervous. "The board has asked me to step down from my enforcement role. I'll remain on the HOA board, but I'll be focusing on communication and community events instead." James wasn't entirely surprised by this news. While Patricia's intentions had been good, her aggressive approach to enforcement had created several other conflicts in the community over the years. The incident with his vehicle had simply been the most dramatic example of how her methods could go wrong. "How do you feel about that change?" James asked. Patricia was quiet for a moment before answering. "Honestly, I think it's for the best. I realize now that I was so focused on enforcing the rules that I lost sight of why the rules exist in the first place. They're supposed to help people live together peacefully, not create conflict." She continued, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened that day. I made assumptions about you and your vehicle based on limited information, and I acted on those assumptions without trying to get the full picture. That's not the kind of person I want to be, and it's not the kind of community leader we need." James appreciated Patricia's honesty and self-reflection. "I think you've learned something that a lot of people in positions of authority struggle with. The difference between having the power to do something and having the judgment to know when and how to use that power." The conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door. James excused himself and found Robert Chen and Mrs. Peterson standing on his porch together. "Sorry to bother you, Detective Washington, but we wanted to give you an update on the community meeting we held last night." James invited them in, and the group gathered in his living room. It felt strange to have these three people in his house, considering that a month ago he barely knew any of them beyond casual greetings. Robert was carrying a folder thick with papers. "We had 47 residents attend the meeting last night, which is the highest turnout we've ever had for a community event. The main topic was the new HOA procedures, but we also discussed some other changes that people have been requesting." Mrs. Peterson spoke up. "Several residents said they've felt more comfortable approaching the HOA with concerns since the new procedures were put in place. Before, some people were afraid that any complaint would result in immediate enforcement action. That's exactly what we were hoping for," James said. "The goal should be to solve problems, not to punish people for minor violations." Robert opened his folder and pulled out a document. "We've also created a new position, Community Liaison Officer. This person will be responsible for initial contact with residents about any issues, and they'll focus on education and voluntary compliance rather than enforcement." The conversation continued for another hour, covering various aspects of the community's transformation. James was impressed by how seriously the HOA board and residents had taken the lessons from the incident. Rather than simply making minimal changes to avoid future liability, they had used it as an opportunity to fundamentally rethink how their community operated. As his visitors prepared to leave, Patricia turned back to James one more time. "Detective Washington, I want you to know that I've learned something important from all of this. I thought I was protecting the community by being strict about the rules, but I realize now that protecting the community means protecting the people in it, not just the property values." After everyone left, James sat in his living room thinking about how much had changed in such a short time. The incident with his Jeep could have led to legal battles, community divisions, and lasting resentment. Instead, it had become a catalyst for positive change that would benefit everyone in Meadowbrook Heights. James's phone buzzed with a text message from his partner at the police department. The task force operation they had been working on for months was finally coming to a close, with several arrests made and a significant drug trafficking network dismantled. The irony wasn't lost on him that, while he had been working to protect the broader community through his police work, his own neighborhood had been learning important lessons about protection, community, and justice. That evening, as James parked his Jeep in the same spot where all the trouble had started, he noticed that Mrs. Peterson was working in her garden. She looked up and waved, and he walked over to chat with her about her flowers. "You know," Mrs. Peterson said as they talked, "I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, but I feel like I know my neighbors better now than I ever did before. Sometimes it takes a crisis to bring people together." James agreed. The incident with Patricia and the HOA had forced everyone in Meadowbrook Heights to think more carefully about how they treated each other and how they wanted their community to function. In the end, that might have been the most valuable outcome of all. As he walked back to his house, James reflected on the fact that being a police officer had taught him that most conflicts arise from misunderstandings, fear, and failure to communicate. The same principles that helped him resolve disputes on the street had proved useful in his own neighborhood. Sometimes the most important police work happened not in dramatic confrontations, but in quiet conversations that helped people understand each other better. The security chain on his Jeep was new and stronger than the original, but James hoped it would never again be the center of community controversy. Meadowbrook Heights had learned its lessons, and everyone was better for it.